Sarah Mitchell placed the check on the bar counter. $12,000, written in careful sloping handwriting by Mr. Whitmore, a regular guest who had been coming to Thornton's for longer than Sarah had been alive. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with intention and gratitude for a year of excellent service. Derek Vance looked down at the check. Then he looked at Sarah. The fluorescent lights of the Boyd office caught the sharp angles of his face, turning his expression into something cold and surgical. "Where did you get this?" His voice was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made Sarah's stomach tighten with the memory of other quiet voices in other offices, voices that had ended her career 5 years ago with the same careful precision. "Mr. Whitmore gave it to me, sir. He wanted me to deposit it into my account." Sarah kept her own voice steady, professional, the tone she had perfected over 6 months of working at Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. "He said it was for exceptional service throughout the year." Derek held the check up to the light theatrical in his examination. The dining room beyond the office door hummed with Saturday evening conversation, the gentle clink of crystal, the soft music that cost more per hour than Sarah made in a week. None of those sounds penetrated the sudden thick silence between them. "I've known Mr. Whitmore for 15 years, Derek said slowly, still studying the check as if it were a forgery, as if the signature were somehow suspect. "He's never tipped more than $500. Not once." He turned. His eyes found Tony Reeves, the head of security, standing near the employee entrance. "Tony, call the police." The world tilted sideways. Sarah felt her heartbeat in her throat and her fingertips in the space behind her eyes. She had been careful. She had been so careful. 6 months of keeping her head down, of serving tables with a smile that never faltered, of pretending she didn't recognize Derek Vance from another life, another version of herself that had worn suits instead of aprons and analyzed fraud instead of memorizing wine pairings. "Sir, I didn't do anything wrong. Mr. Whitmore gave me this check. You can ask him yourself. He's still at table 7. "What I can do," Derek interrupted, his voice rising, now pitched to carry beyond the office door into the main dining room, where 24 tables full of Manhattan's wealthiest citizens were finishing their entrees, "is call the authorities on an employee who thinks she can steal from our guests and lie about it to management." Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway, 58 years old, 22 years at Thornton's head waiter, with the kind of quiet dignity that made guests feel simultaneously welcomed and appropriately humbled. His eyes met Sarah's for just a moment. She saw something there: recognition, sympathy, and beneath it all, fear. He said nothing. Frank Chen, barely 23, a busboy who still moved through the dining room with the uncertainty of someone not quite sure he belonged in a place this expensive, this white, this far removed from the restaurant his parents ran in Chinatown, stood frozen near the kitchen door. His eyes were wide. He looked at Sarah, then at Derek, then down at his shoes. He said nothing either. The dining room had gone quiet. Not silent, that would have been too obvious, but the conversation had softened. The laughter had stopped, and Sarah could feel the weight of attention shifting toward the office door, toward the scene unfolding like some kind of dinner theater entertainment between courses. Derek ripped the check in half. The sound was surprisingly loud, paper tearing clean and final. He dropped both pieces. They fluttered down and landed on Sarah's chest, on the crisp white shirt of her uniform. The shirt she had ironed that morning with the same care she brought to everything, the shirt that represented 6 months of holding herself together through sheer force of will. "You're fired," Derek said. Each word was articulated with perfect clarity, performed for the audience beyond the door. "And if you don't leave this restaurant, immediately you will be arrested for fraud and theft. Do you understand me?" Sarah stood very still. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in front of men like Derek Vance gave them something they wanted, some confirmation of power that fed whatever darkness lived inside them. She did not beg. Begging had not worked 5 years ago at JPMorgan Chase, when Derek had been assistant manager at the hotel chain they were auditing, when he had turned her discovery of his $300,000 embezzlement scheme into an accusation against her, when he had used his connections and her lack of them to have her fired, blacklisted, erased from an industry she had loved. She simply looked at him. And in that moment, something shifted, something that had been dormant for 6 months, for 5 years, for longer than that, if she was honest. Something from before the fall, from when she had been Sarah Mitchell, the analyst, the fraud detector, the woman who could look at a spreadsheet and see the story hidden in the numbers, who could find the pattern in the chaos, who had believed that truth mattered and that speaking it was not just a right, but a responsibility. "I'll go," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, dangerously steady. "But I'll be back. And when I come back, I'll bring proof." Derek's eyes narrowed. For just a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty. Perhaps even recognition, though he had been so careful to pretend he didn't remember her, to treat her as just another expendable employee rather than the woman whose career he had destroyed to protect his own secrets. Then the moment passed, his expression smoothed back into contempt. Get out. Sarah walked through the dining room. Every table watched her. She could feel their eyes, their curiosity, their judgment. A young black woman in a server's uniform being escorted toward the exit was not tragedy to them. It was spectacle. Something to mention later, over after-dinner drinks, a brief disruption in the carefully orchestrated evening, already forgotten by the time dessert arrived. The night air hit her face like a slap. Manhattan in October, cold enough to sting the city lights reflecting off buildings that reached toward a sky she couldn't see. Thornton's occupied the ground floor of a glass tower on Madison Avenue, all gleaming surfaces and expensive promises. Sarah had walked through that door 6 months ago with her resume in her bag and desperation in her chest, and she had been grateful. So grateful when they had hired her, despite the gap in her employment history, despite the vague references, despite everything about her that screamed damaged goods. She had not known Derek Vance worked there, had not known that the man who had destroyed her career had climbed even higher, had leveraged his theft and his lies into a position as chief financial officer of the Thornton Hospitality Group, overseeing not just this restaurant, but a dozen hotels and properties across the city. She had found out on her first day when he had walked into the pre-shift meeting, and she had felt the blood drain from her face, felt 6 months of carefully constructed stability crack like ice beneath her feet. He had looked at her with those cold eyes and smiled. Welcome to Thornton's, he had said to the group of new hires, his gaze sliding past Sarah as if she were invisible. I'm Derek Vance, CFO. I expect excellence. I expect loyalty. And I expect you to understand that this restaurant's reputation is built on trust. Betray that trust and you will be removed, immediately and permanently. The threat had been clear. To everyone else, it was just corporate rhetoric. To Sarah, it was a promise. Stay quiet, stay small, or I will destroy you again. She had stayed quiet. She had been so tired of fighting. Sarah walked 12 blocks before she let herself stop. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. The subway entrance gaped in front of her stairs, leading down into fluorescent light and the smell of hot metal and humanity. She descended without thinking, muscle memory, carrying her through the turnstile onto the platform, into a train car, half empty on a Saturday night. The apartment was in the Bronx, a fifth-floor walk-up in a building that had been old when her mother was young. 2 bedrooms for 3 people, a kitchen that doubled as a dining room, a bathroom with tiles that never quite came clean, no matter how hard Sarah scrubbed. Rent was $1,800 a month, which was cheap by New York standards and catastrophic by hers. She climbed the stairs slowly. Her feet hurt. Her chest hurt. Everything hurt in that dull, spreading way that meant she couldn't afford to think about it, couldn't afford to stop moving, because if she stopped, she might not start again. The door was unlocked. Jordan always left it unlocked when he was home, despite Sarah's constant reminders about safety, about the neighborhood, about the kinds of things that could happen. At 16, he still believed the world was fundamentally good, that bad things happened to other people, that his sister's paranoia was just that, paranoia rather than experience. Sarah, his voice drifted from the living room. That you, yeah, it's me. She found him at the kitchen table, textbooks spread across the surface, earbuds trailing from his ears to his phone. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted from concentration to concern in the space of a heartbeat. You're home early. You okay? I'm fine. The lie came automatically. Just a slow night. They cut me. Jordan studied her face for a moment longer, then nodded and returned to his homework. Calculus, from the look of the equations, which meant he was still on track for the scholarship, still maintaining the grades that were the only thing standing between him and a future that looked suspiciously like Sarah's present. Their mother's voice came from the bedroom, weak but warm. Sarah, baby. Yeah, Mama, I'm here. Grace Mitchell's room was small enough that the hospital bed took up most of the space. The oxygen machine sat beside it, tubes running to the cannula in her nose, the soft hiss of pressurized air, a constant background noise that Sarah had learned to tune out the same way she tuned out the subway, the sirens, the sounds of the city that never quite slept. Grace was propped up on pillows, her laptop balanced on her knees, some true crime documentary playing on mute with subtitles. She smiled when Sarah entered, and for a moment Sarah could see the woman her mother had been before the heart failure, before the medical bills, before everything had narrowed down to this room and this machine and the slow, inexorable countdown of a failing organ. How was work? Fine. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, carefully mindful of the tubes and wires. Busy. You know how Saturdays are? Grace reached out and took Sarah's hand. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were sharp, the kind of sharp that came from 26 years of reading her daughter's face, of knowing when words and truth were different things. Baby, what happened? Sarah felt something crack in her chest. Not break, not yet, but crack enough that she had to look away. Had to focus on the oxygen machine's digital display, the numbers that measured her mother's breathing, that quantified the gap between alive and not alive with the cold precision of mathematics. I got fired. The words hung in the air. Grace's hand tightened around hers. What did they say you did? Stole a check from a guest. $12,000. Derek Vance tore it up in front of everyone and called security. Sarah's voice was steady. She was proud of that. Mr. Whitmore gave me the check as a tip. Derek didn't believe me. Or maybe he did believe me and just didn't care. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then Derek Vance. That's the man from before, isn't it? From the bank job. Sarah nodded. Did he recognize you? Yes. And he's been making your life hell for 6 months. Yes. Grace closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there were tears there, but her voice was fierce. Baby, you cannot let him do this. Not again. You are not the scared girl you were 5 years ago. You are not the woman who kept quiet because she thought silence would protect her. You are better than that, stronger than that. Mama, I don't have the energy to fight him. I don't have the money for a lawyer. I don't have... You have your brain, Grace interrupted. You have your training. You have everything they tried to take from you, and it's still there, Sarah. It's still there. You just have to use it. Sarah looked at her mother. 52 years and dying by inches, medical bills climbing past $4,000 a month, insurance that covered almost nothing, a life that had been hard from the beginning and had never gotten easier. Grace had been a hostess at a hotel restaurant 27 years ago when she had gotten pregnant by one of the executives, a white man named Richard Thornton, who had offered money for an abortion and threats when she refused, who had fired her and blacklisted her and walked away from his responsibility with the ease of someone who had never faced consequences for anything. Grace had raised Sarah alone, had worked 3 jobs to keep them fed and housed and clothed, had sacrificed everything so that her daughter could go to college, could get a degree in finance, could build the kind of life that was supposed to be impossible for a black woman from the Bronx with no connections and no money and no father willing to claim her. And Sarah had done it. She had gotten the degree. She had gotten the job at J.P. Morgan Chase. She had been good at it, so good that they had put her on the fraud detection team within 2 years, had trusted her with the kind of analysis that could make or break careers, that could send people to prison or set them free. Until Derek Vance. Until she had found his scheme, his careful siphoning of funds from the hotel chain into offshore accounts, his falsified vendor invoices and forged signatures. Until she had reported it to her supervisor, believing that truth and evidence were enough that the system would work the way it was supposed to work. Until Derek had turned it around. Until he had used his connections to plant evidence against her, to paint her as the thief, to have her investigated and fired and blacklisted from every financial institution in the city. Until her name became poison and her resume became a list of red flags and her future became this struggling to survive, while the man who had destroyed her climbed higher and higher on the foundation of his own corruption. Mama, even if I wanted to fight him, I wouldn't know where to start. He's a CFO now. He has power, connections, money. You're just the woman who found his fraud once before, Grace said quietly. And if he's still the man I think he is, he's still stealing. Men like that don't stop. They just get better at hiding it. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something that might become hope if she let it. Something that felt like the ember of anger that had kept her alive through the worst of the last 5 years. Her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket and looked at the screen. Marcus Webb, she answered. Sarah. His voice was low, urgent. I'm sorry I didn't speak up tonight. I'm a coward. I know I'm a coward. But I need to tell you something about Derek. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Bronx, stretching away in all directions. Lights and lives and stories she would never know. What about him? I've worked at Thornton's for 22 years. I know every number, every invoice, every detail of how that restaurant operates. And for the last 3 years since Derek became CFO, the numbers haven't made sense. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. What do you mean? Invoices from vendors I've never seen. Deliveries that never arrive. Purchase orders for supplies we already have. Small things spread out over time, but they add up. I've been too scared to say anything. I have a wife, 2 kids in college, a mortgage. I can't afford to lose this job. How much are we talking about? Sarah's voice was calm now. Professional, the voice of the analyst she used to be. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, I don't know exactly, but if I had to guess, over 3 years, maybe 2 million, maybe more. $2 million. Sarah felt the numbers slot into place in her mind, felt the old patterns reasserting themselves, the ability to see the shape of fraud in the negative space of legitimate transactions. Marcus, she said quietly, if I look into this, if I find proof, would you be willing to testify, to go on record? Another long silence. She could hear him breathing, could imagine him standing in his kitchen or his bedroom, weighing his fear against his conscience, trying to calculate the cost of both options. If you find proof, he said, finally, real proof that would hold up, that would protect me if I came forward, then yes, I'll testify. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of watching him get away with it. Okay, Sarah said, give me time. I'll find the proof. She hung up and turned back to face her mother. Grace was smiling. It was a small smile, tired and proud and fierce all at once. There's my daughter. There's the woman I raised. Sarah looked at her phone, then at her mother, then out the window at the city that had chewed her up and spit her out and expected her to stay down. I'm going back, she said, not as an employee, as an investigator. Derek Vance destroyed my career once. I'm not going to let him do it again, and I'm not going to let him keep stealing from people who don't have the power to fight back. What do you need? Grace asked. Time, access, and courage. Sarah smiled, and it felt strange on her face, unfamiliar, after so many months of careful neutrality. I think I have 2 out of 3. Jordan appeared in the doorway, having abandoned his calculus in favor of eavesdropping on his sister's conversation. What's going on? Sarah looked at him, 16 years old, smart enough for scholarships, innocent enough to still believe in justice, old enough to understand what she was about to tell him. I got fired tonight, falsely accused of theft, but I'm going to prove I didn't do anything wrong, and I'm going to prove that the man who fired me has been stealing from his company for years. Jordan's eyes went wide. That's like detective stuff. You're gonna investigate him. I already started investigating him 5 years ago. I just didn't finish the job. This time I will. What if he comes after you again? Jordan's voice was small, now scared in a way that made Sarah's chest ache. What if he gets you arrested or blacklisted again? Or worse? Sarah crossed the room and pulled her brother into a hug. He was taller than her, now had been for almost a year, but he still felt like the kid she had walked to elementary school, had helped with homework, had promised that things would be okay even when she had no idea if that promise was true. Then I'll deal with it, she said quietly, but I'm not going to live in fear of Derek Vance anymore. I'm not going to let him win just because fighting back is scary. You understand? Jordan nodded against her shoulder. Can I help? You can help by keeping your grades up and staying out of trouble and taking care of Mama when I'm not here. That's the most important job. Okay. Okay, Sarah released him and turned back to her mother. I need to check something. I'll be back. She went to her room, the smallest of the 2 bedrooms, barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser. Her laptop sat on the floor, 3 years old and running slowly but still functional. She opened it and waited for the ancient machine to boot up, listening to the fan whir and strain against the dust that had accumulated despite her best efforts to clean it. 5 years ago, when she had been fired from J.P. Morgan Chase, she had packed up her desk in a daze. They had given her 10 minutes. Security had stood over her while she emptied drawers and unplugged equipment, making sure she didn't take anything that belonged to the company, treating her like a criminal before she had even been charged with anything. But they had let her keep her personal laptop. And on that laptop, in a folder buried 3 levels deep and labeled with an innocuous name she barely remembered, were copies of every file she had compiled on Derek Vance's embezzlement scheme. She had kept them. She didn't know why. Some mixture of paranoia and hope, some sense that maybe someday the truth would matter, that evidence would be valuable, that the system would eventually work the way it was supposed to. She found the folder, opened it. 73 documents. Spreadsheets, bank statements, correspondence, invoices, comparison analyses. Everything she had found, everything she had reported. Everything that had been ignored in favor of Derek's counter-accusation. She began to read. The fraud was elegant in its simplicity. Derek had created a fake vendor, an entity that existed only on paper, and had used his position as assistant manager to approve invoices from that vendor for services that were never rendered. The hotel chain had paid those invoices, and the money had disappeared into offshore accounts that Derek controlled through shell corporations. Sarah had found it because she was good at her job. She had noticed the pattern, the regularity of the payments, the lack of corresponding work orders or delivery confirmations. She had traced the corporate structure and found the shells. She had documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who believed in systems, in processes, in the idea that truth and evidence were enough. She had been wrong about that, but she had not been wrong about the fraud. Now, 5 years later, looking at the files with the perspective of someone who had learned exactly how much corruption could flourish when protected by power and connections, she saw something else. Derek's scheme at the hotel chain had been small, relatively speaking. 300,000 over 18 months. Not enough to draw serious attention from the corporate audit team, especially when he had someone to blame and evidence to plant. But if Marcus Webb was right, if Derek was running the same scheme at Thornton's, but on a larger scale over a longer period with more authority and less oversight, then they were talking about millions of dollars. And this time Sarah knew what she was looking for. This time she knew how Derek operated, how he structured his thefts, what patterns to search for in the chaos of legitimate business transactions. This time she would be ready. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Sarah Mitchell, a man's voice, young, scared. Who is this? Frank Chen. I'm a busboy at Thornton's. I was there tonight when Derek fired you. I I need to talk to you, but not on the phone. Can we meet somewhere? Sarah's heart rate picked up. Why do you want to talk to me? Because Derek threatened me last week. He told me if I ever said anything about what I saw in the back office, he'd have me deported. My family came here from China when I was 5. We have green cards, we're legal, but he said he'd find a way. And I believe him. I believe he'd do it. What did you see in the back office, Frank? Silence, then quietly, him signing papers that weren't his to sign, using someone else's signature. I didn't know what it meant then, but tonight after what he did to you, I started thinking. And I'm scared. I'm really scared. Sarah closed her eyes, felt the pieces clicking into place, felt the shape of the case beginning to emerge from the darkness. Where do you want to meet? They agreed on a coffee shop in the morning. Neutral territory, public but not too crowded, the kind of place where two people could talk without being overheard. Sarah hung up and stared at the files on her laptop screen. Then she opened a new document and began to type. Investigation plan, Derek Vance Thornton's restaurant. Objective document, systematic fraud and embezzlement. Timeline 3 weeks maximum. Need evidence before Derek can cover his tracks. She worked through the night. By the time the sun rose over the Bronx painting, the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the ugly buildings look almost beautiful, she had a plan. It was dangerous. It required access. She didn't have cooperation from people who were terrified, proof that might not exist or might be too well hidden to find. But it was possible. And more importantly, it was necessary. Sarah closed her laptop and went to the kitchen, made coffee, looked at the bills stacked on the counter, the numbers that represented everything she owed and everything she needed just to survive. Medical expenses for her mother, rent, utilities, Jordan's school fees. The gap between what she earned and what she needed was a chasm that grew wider every month. She had lost her job, again, because of Derek Vance. Again, she could walk away. Find another service job, another restaurant or retail position that would pay minimum wage and expect maximum effort and treat her as expendable, because that's what the economy had decided people like her were. Or she could fight back. Sarah picked up her phone and called the coffee shop to confirm her reservation. Then she opened her closet and looked at the suit hanging in the back, the one she had worn to job interviews that went nowhere, the one that represented a version of herself she had tried to forget. She took it out, brushed the dust from the shoulders, held it up to the light. Tomorrow she would meet Frank Chen. Tomorrow she would start gathering evidence. Tomorrow she would become Sarah Mitchell, the investigator again, the fraud detector, the woman who could see through lies and find truth in numbers. Tonight she stood in her tiny room in the Bronx and made a promise to herself, to her mother, to every person who had ever been crushed by someone like Derek Vance and told that fighting back was futile. She would find the proof. She would expose the fraud. And this time Derek Vance would not walk away. The coffee shop was called Brew Haven, tucked between a laundromat and a bodega on Amsterdam Avenue. The kind of place that served decent espresso to neighborhood regulars who couldn't afford the artisanal cafes colonizing the area block by block. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, ordered a black coffee she didn't drink, and positioned herself at a corner table where she could see both entrances. Frank Chen arrived exactly on time. 23 years old, wearing a jacket too thin for October weather, hands shoved deep in his pockets. His eyes scanned the room twice before he spotted Sarah, and even then he hesitated at the door. Fear and determination warring across his young face. Sarah raised her hand slightly. He crossed to her table and sat down without ordering anything. "Thank you for meeting me," he said quietly. "Thank you for calling." Sarah kept her voice gentle. Frank reminded her of Jordan, that same vulnerability of someone still figuring out how the world worked, still believing it might be fair if he just followed the rules. "Tell me what you saw." Frank glanced around the coffee shop. An old man reading a newspaper. A woman with headphones typing on a laptop. No one paying attention to them. Still, he lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. "It was about 2 months ago. Late night, maybe 2 in the morning. I'd forgotten my phone at the restaurant after my shift, so I came back to get it. The main entrance was locked, but I have a key to the service entrance because sometimes I open in the mornings." He paused, fingers twisting together on the table. Sarah waited. "I heard someone in the office, Derek's office. The light was on under the door. I thought maybe it was a break-in, so I got closer, quiet, trying to see. And I looked through the window in the door just for a second." "What did you see?" "Derek was sitting at his desk with a stack of papers. Invoices, I think. And he was signing them, but not with his own signature. He had another piece of paper next to him like he was copying someone else's signature. Over and over. Maybe 20 or 30 invoices." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. "Did you see whose signature he was copying?" "No, the paper was too far away, but it had to be someone important, right? Someone who had authority to approve things he couldn't approve himself." "Did he see you?" "I don't think so." I backed away and left through the service entrance as quietly as I could. But the next day at work, he pulled me aside. He said someone had been in the building after hours, said security footage showed movement, asked if I'd seen anything unusual. Frank's voice dropped even lower. I lied. I told him I hadn't been there. And he smiled at me, this cold smile, and said that was good. That sometimes people see things they shouldn't see, and those people end up in very difficult situations. He mentioned my parents' restaurant, said it would be terrible if immigration enforcement decided to audit their business. He said it very casually, like he was making conversation. But I understood. "Your parents are here legally." "Yes, green cards, work permits, everything proper." But Derek made it sound like that wouldn't matter if he decided to cause trouble, and I believed him. "After what happened to you last night, I know he would do it." Sarah studied Frank's face. He was terrified, but still here, still willing to talk. That took courage. Most people never had to discover in themselves. "Frank, if I investigate Derek, if I find evidence of what he's doing, I might need you to testify, to tell people what you saw. Are you prepared for that?" Frank was quiet for a long time. Outside the city moved past the coffee shop window in its endless rhythm. Buses and taxis and people going to jobs that paid their bills and didn't require them to be heroes. "My dad came here with nothing," Frank said finally. "He washed dishes for 20 years, saved every penny, bought the restaurant when I was 12. He always told me that in America, if you work hard and follow the rules, you can build something. You can be safe." He looked up at Sarah. "But that's not true, is it? Not for people like us. People like Derek make the rules and they only apply when it's convenient. My dad followed every rule. You probably followed every rule. And Derek just does whatever he wants because he has power and we don't." "That's why evidence matters," Sarah said quietly. "Power can protect you from accusations. It can't protect you from proof." Frank nodded slowly. "If you find proof, real proof, that would hold up in court, I'll testify. I'll tell them what I saw. But you have to be sure. You have to be absolutely sure. Because if we try and fail, he'll destroy all of us." "I know. That's why I need to be careful. Thorough. Patient." They talked for another 20 minutes. Frank gave her details about the restaurant's schedule, the security systems, who had keys to which doors when Derek typically worked late. Tactical information that might prove invaluable. When they parted, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. She wasn't just investigating for herself anymore. She was carrying Frank's fear and Marcus Webb's 22 years of complicity and her mother's sacrifice in her brother's future. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and Derek would crush all of them. She couldn't afford mistakes. The next morning, Sarah returned to Thornton's, Not through the front entrance with its gleaming brass and uniformed doorman, but through the service alley where deliveries arrived and trash went out, where the restaurant's expensive facade gave way to the industrial reality of feeding wealthy people. Marcus Webb had agreed to meet her at 6 a.m. before the morning prep crew arrived. He was waiting by the loading dock, looking older than he had 2 nights ago, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. "You came," he said. "I told you I would. You have the access card." Marcus pulled a plastic card from his pocket. "My supervisor override works on every door in the building except the safe and Richard Thornton's private office. But Sarah, if they check the logs, they'll see I let you in. They won't check unless they have reason to, and we'll be gone before anyone else arrives." Marcus hesitated, then handed her the card. "Derek's office is on the third floor, administrative wing. File cabinets should be unlocked during the day, but he locks them before he leaves. I don't have the key." "I'm not looking for files in his office. Those would be too obvious, too easy for him to hide or destroy if he gets suspicious. I need to see the central bookkeeping records, the invoices that get processed through accounting before they reach Derek for approval." Marcus's eyebrows rose. "You think he's stealing before the money even reaches his level?" "I think he's created a system that looks legitimate at every stage. Fake vendors with real-looking invoices, proper paperwork, everything filed correctly. The only way to spot it is to trace the money all the way through and check if the services were actually rendered." They entered through the service door. The restaurant in early morning was a different creature than the elegant space Sarah knew from her shifts. Harsh overhead lights instead of soft ambiance. The smell of industrial cleaner instead of expensive perfume. Stainless steel and tile instead of mahogany and marble. Marcus led her through the kitchen past the prep stations where in a few hours cooks would transform raw ingredients into dishes that cost more than Sarah's weekly grocery budget. Up a back staircase to the second floor, through a hallway lined with offices. The accounting department was a modest room with 3 desks, filing cabinets lining one wall, a large safe in the corner. Marcus used his card on the door and they slipped inside. "Invoices are filed by vendor," Marcus said, pointing to the cabinets, "alphabetically, going back 5 years. What are you looking for?" Sarah pulled out her phone and opened a note she'd made the night before. "Start with E-Elite Provisions. That's the name Derek used at the hotel chain 5 years ago. If he's lazy or arrogant, he might have reused it." Marcus opened the E-drawer and flipped through folders. His fingers stopped. "Elite Provisions, LLC. Jesus, it's here." Sarah felt electricity run down her spine. She pulled the folder and laid it on the nearest desk. Inside were invoices, dozens of them dating back 3 years. Everyone for restaurant supplies produced meat, seafood, specialty ingredients. Everyone for amounts between $2,000 and $4,000. Small enough not to trigger enhanced scrutiny, large enough to add up. She pulled out her phone and started photographing. Every invoice, every page. 47 invoices total. Marcus checked the delivery logs, see if Elite Provisions shows up in the receiving records. While Marcus searched another cabinet, Sarah studied the invoices more carefully. They looked legitimate. Professional formatting, detailed line items, proper tax calculations. But something was off about the signature at the bottom. The authorization signature that approved payment. She pulled out her wallet and extracted a business card she'd picked up from the restaurant's lobby months ago. Richard Thornton, CEO, Thornton Hospitality Group. His signature was printed at the bottom in elegant script. She compared it to the signatures on the invoices. Close, very close, but not perfect. The capital R had a slightly different flourish. The final N was more angular than curved. Details that would escape casual inspection but stood out under careful scrutiny. Forgeries, just like Frank had seen Derek creating at 2 in the morning. "Sarah," Marcus's voice was tight. "Elite Provisions doesn't appear in the receiving logs. Not once. 47 invoices, 0 recorded deliveries." There it was, the gap between paperwork and reality, the space where fraud lived. "Print the receiving logs for the last 3 years, every page." Marcus moved to the computer, logged in with his credentials, and sent the documents to the printer. While the machine hummed and churned out paper, Sarah continued photographing. Not just the Elite Provisions invoices, but also the legitimate vendor files for comparison. She would need to show the pattern, the difference between real business and fake transactions. They worked in silence for 40 minutes. Sarah's phone filled with images. Marcus compiled paper documents into neat stacks. They were methodical, careful, leaving everything exactly as they'd found it. At 6:45, they heard voices in the hallway. The morning crew arriving. Marcus froze. We need to go, now. Sarah grabbed the last stack of papers, photographed them in quick succession, then helped Marcus return everything to its proper place. They slipped out of the accounting office seconds before someone rounded the corner. Marcus's override card getting them through doors that should have been locked. Sarah's heart pounding in a rhythm that felt like fear and exhilaration mixed together in equal measure. They made it back to the service alley. Marcus was sweating despite the cold morning air. That was too close, he said. But we got what we needed. Marcus, thank you. You just helped expose a major fraud. Marcus shook his head. I didn't help. I just stopped looking the other way. There's a difference. Sarah left him there and walked to the subway. On the train, she reviewed the photographs on her phone. Hundreds of images, invoices, signatures, receiving logs, everything she would need to build a case. But she needed more than documents. She needed to prove Elite Provisions didn't exist as a legitimate business. At home, Jordan was already awake eating cereal before school. Grace was still sleeping, her breathing audible through the bedroom door, steady but labored. Sarah opened her laptop and got to work. First, the New York State Business Registry. She searched for Elite Provisions, LLC. The company existed on paper, registered 3 years ago, with a business address in Manhattan. But when she checked the address on Google Street View, it was a UPS store. A mailbox rental, not an actual business location. Next, she searched for Elite Provisions supplier licenses. Food service vendors in New York needed permits from the Department of Health, licenses from the Department of Agriculture, insurance documentation. Elite Provisions had none of these. Then bank records. This was trickier. She couldn't access private financial information without a subpoena, but she could check public records for lawsuits, liens, business filings. Elite Provisions had no employees registered with the state, no tax payments recorded, no legal presence beyond the bare minimum registration. It was a ghost company, a shell that existed only to receive money and funnel it elsewhere. Sarah pulled up the database she'd built 5 years ago, tracking Derek's previous scheme. The pattern was identical. Same structure, same methodology scaled up for a larger operation. She began building a spreadsheet, one column for each Elite Provisions invoice. Date, amount, supposed service, authorization, signature. Another column for cross-reference with receiving logs. A third for business verification checks. 47 invoices. 0 actual deliveries. $2.3 million paid out over 3 years. The math was elegant in its simplicity. Derek had stolen an average of $65,000 per month by creating fake invoices, forging Richard Thornton's signature to authorize payment, and having the money transferred to his shell company's account. But where did the money go after Elite Provisions received it? Sarah spent the next 2 days tracing the corporate structure. Elite Provisions, LLC, was registered to another shell company called DV Holdings. The initials weren't subtle. Derek Vance might be smart, but he was also arrogant, confident that no one would look this closely. DV Holdings was registered in Delaware, a state famous for loose corporate regulations and privacy protections. The registered agent was a law firm that specialized in asset protection for wealthy clients. Sarah couldn't access the bank records without legal authorization. But she didn't need to. The pattern was clear enough. Money flowed from Thornton's to Elite Provisions to DV Holdings, and DV Holdings was owned by Derek Vance. She documented everything, built a presentation with each piece of evidence clearly labeled, each connection explicitly drawn. This wasn't just about having proof. It was about making the proof so obvious, so comprehensive that no one could look at it and claim confusion or uncertainty. On the third day, Marcus called. Derek knows something's wrong, he said without preamble. He's been asking questions about security logs. He looked at the camera footage from last week. He's paranoid. Did he see us? I don't think so. The cameras don't cover the accounting office interior, but he knows someone accessed the administrative wing during off hours. He's on alert. Sarah felt a chill run through her. How much time do I have? I don't know. Maybe a week. Maybe less. If he decides to purge the files or alter the records, all your evidence disappears. Sarah looked at her laptop, at the spreadsheet and the photographs and the careful documentation she'd been building. It was good. It was thorough. But was it enough? I need a smoking gun, she said. Something that proves Derek personally benefited from this fraud. Something that ties him directly to the shell companies. How are you going to get that? Sarah thought for a moment. Then the security footage Frank mentioned, the video of Derek forging signatures. Does that still exist? Maybe. Security footage is kept for 90 days, then overwritten. If Frank saw Derek 2 months ago, there might still be a copy. Can you access it? Not without Derek's authorization. He's the only one with admin rights to the security system. Sarah closed her eyes. So close. Everything she needed was right there, locked behind digital walls she couldn't breach without committing crimes that would invalidate everything she'd discovered. There has to be another way, she muttered. That night, Grace called Sarah into her bedroom. The oxygen machine hissed softly in the background. Grace's face was drawn tired in a way that spoke of pain being endured rather than conquered. Baby, I need to tell you something about Richard Thornton. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed. Mama, we don't need to talk about him. That's old history. It's not history. It's current. Richard Thornton is the CEO of Thornton Hospitality, the company Derek works for, the company you're investigating. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. She'd known the restaurant was named Thornton's. She'd known Richard Thornton was the CEO, but somehow she hadn't connected it to her mother's story to the man who had abandoned Grace 27 years ago. You mean, I mean you're investigating fraud at a company owned by your biological father, a man who doesn't know you exist, a man who tried very hard to make sure you never existed. Sarah stared at her mother. The implications cascaded through her mind. If Richard Thornton discovered who she was, would he help her expose Derek, or would he see her as a threat, a liability, someone who could damage his company's reputation and his personal legacy? Does this change what you're doing? Grace asked softly. Sarah thought about Derek Vance sitting in his office signing fake invoices with someone else's name, stealing millions, while people like Marcus Webb and Frank Chen lived in fear. About her own career destroyed, her mother dying by inches from lack of proper medical care, her brother's future depending on scholarships and luck. About justice delayed being justice denied. No, Sarah said firmly. It doesn't change anything. Derek Vance is stealing from Thornton's. That's a fact. Whether Richard Thornton is my father or a stranger doesn't make the theft less real. Grace smiled. It was a sad smile, proud and painful at once. You're better than both of us. You know that better than me for staying quiet all those years. Better than Richard for walking away. You're going to fight for what's right even when it costs you. Even when it's dangerous. I learned that from you, Mama. No, baby. I stayed quiet because I was scared. You're speaking up despite being scared. That's courage. Real courage. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't get the security footage herself. But maybe she didn't need to. Maybe the evidence she already had was enough to force Derek into making a mistake. She called Frank Chen. I need you to deliver a message to Derek. Can you do that without it seeming suspicious? What kind of message? Tell him someone submitted an anonymous tip to the restaurant's corporate compliance hotline. Tell him the tip mentioned irregularities with vendor payments. Tell him corporate is going to audit the accounts. Frank was quiet. That's not true, is it? Not yet. But if Derek thinks it's true, he'll panic. He'll try to cover his tracks. And panicked people make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? The kind that create evidence we can use. Will you do it? Another pause. Then yes, I'll tell him today. Sarah spent the rest of the day preparing. She created multiple backup copies of all her evidence, uploaded them to cloud storage, emailed encrypted versions to an address she created specifically for this purpose, made physical copies and stored them in 3 different locations. If Derek came after her, if he tried to destroy the evidence or discredit her again, she would be ready. That evening, Marcus called again. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Derek went crazy today. He locked himself in his office for 3 hours, shredding documents, deleting files. Then he called an emergency meeting with the accounting department and told them corporate was conducting a surprise audit. He said everyone needed to make sure their records were perfect. Did he mention what triggered the audit? No, but everyone's terrified. People are staying late, double-checking everything, trying to figure out what's wrong. Sarah felt a grim satisfaction. Derek was reacting exactly as she'd hoped. What about the elite provisions invoices? Gone. He must have pulled them from the files during his office lockdown. The folder's empty. So Derek was destroying evidence. That was predictable, but it was also proof of guilt. Innocent people didn't purge records when they heard about audits. Marcus listened carefully. I need you to document everything. Every file Derek removes, every instruction he gives about what to delete or hide. Write it down, date and time, everything. Can you do that? I can try, but Sarah, if this goes wrong, if we can't prove what he's done, he's going to know it was us. He's going to destroy all of us. I know, that's why we can't fail. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, running through the case in her mind. She had evidence of fraud. She had testimony from witnesses. She had documentation of Derek's panicked response. But did she have enough? At 3 in the morning, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. Sarah Mitchell, a woman's voice professional and familiar. Who is this? My name is Jennifer Torres. I'm an investigator with the New York State Attorney General's Office Financial Crimes Division. I received an interesting email tonight. Someone sent us a detailed dossier about embezzlement at Thornton's restaurant. The email came from your address. Sarah sat up in bed, fully awake now. I didn't send you anything. I thought you might say that, but the evidence in the dossier is quite compelling. Fake vendor invoices, forged signatures, shell companies. It's the kind of case we'd normally take months to build. Whoever compiled this knew exactly what they were doing. Sarah's mind raced. Someone had sent her evidence to the Attorney General. But who and why, Ms. Torres? I don't know who sent you that email, but you do know about the fraud, Jennifer interrupted. Don't you? And you've been investigating it yourself, which is admirable, but also dangerous and legally complicated. Silence. Ms. Mitchell, I'm going to be direct with you. The evidence in this dossier would be inadmissible in court if it was obtained illegally. Breaking and entering unauthorized access to private records, that sort of thing. But it's enough to justify us opening an official investigation. And once we have an official investigation, we can subpoena records legally. What do you need from me? First, I need you to stop investigating on your own. If you gather more evidence illegally, you'll compromise our case. Second, I need you to testify about what you witnessed as an employee. The initial accusation Derek made against you, his behavior, anything that establishes pattern and motive. Can you do that? Yes. Good. Third, I need you to trust me. This investigation will take time. Weeks, maybe months. Derek Vance will continue working at Thornton's during that time. He'll be free, seemingly untouched. You need to be patient and let the system work. Sarah thought about Marcus Webb's fear, Frank Chen's courage, her mother's bills piling up. Patience felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But Jennifer Torres was right. If Sarah confronted Derek now with evidence that might not hold up in court, she would lose. Derek would walk away free, and Sarah would have nothing to show for the risk she'd taken. I'll be patient, Sarah said, but I need you to promise me something. What? When you build this case, when you have everything you need to prosecute, I want to be there. I want to see Derek Vance face consequences for what he's done, not just to me, but to everyone he's hurt. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. I'll see what I can do. In the meantime, stay safe. Maintain your normal routine as much as possible. And Sarah, thank you. People like you, people willing to speak up. That's how we catch people like Derek Vance. The call ended. Sarah sat in the darkness of her bedroom, her phone still warm in her hand. Someone had sent her evidence to the authorities. Someone who had access to her email, her files, her investigation. She got up and went to the living room. Jordan was asleep on the couch, textbook open on his chest. She moved past him quietly to her mother's room. Grace was awake, the blue light from her laptop illuminating her face. Mama, did you send my files to the Attorney General's office? Grace looked up. Her expression was calm, unapologetic. Yes. How did you buy out? You left your laptop open. I know your password. You used my birthday. Grace set her laptop aside. Baby, you were so focused on building a perfect case that you forgot something important. You're not a lawyer. You're not law enforcement. You're one woman with limited resources going up against someone with money and power. You needed help. I was handling it. You were taking too long, and every day you waited was another day Derek could cover his tracks, another day he could figure out what you were doing and come after you. I couldn't sit here and watch you put yourself in danger when there was a faster, safer option. Sarah felt anger rise in her chest, then fade just as quickly. Because her mother was right. Sarah had been so determined to prove she could do this alone to redeem herself from 5 years ago that she'd lost sight of the actual goal, stopping Derek Vance. What if they don't prosecute? What if the case falls apart? Then at least we tried. At least we got official investigators involved. That's more than anyone else has done. Grace reached out and took Sarah's hand. Baby, you don't have to carry the world by yourself. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be brave enough to ask for help when you need it. Sarah squeezed her mother's hand. I'm scared. I know, but you're also brilliant and determined and more capable than you give yourself credit for. And now you have the state's resources behind you. Derek Vance doesn't stand a chance. Sarah returned to her room but still couldn't sleep. Her mind kept circling back to Jennifer Torres' words. Weeks or months of investigation. Derek free and working, potentially destroying more evidence, threatening more people. And somewhere in all of this, Richard Thornton. Her biological father, though he didn't know it. The CEO whose signature Derek had been forging, whose company was being robbed from within. Did Richard know? Was he complicit, or was he just another victim of Derek's manipulation? Sarah didn't have answers. Only questions and half-formed plans, in the growing certainty that she had set something in motion that she could no longer control. Outside her window, the city began to wake. Garbage trucks rumbling through streets, early commuters heading to subway stations. The perpetual motion of New York, indifferent to her struggles, unstoppable in its rhythm. Sarah watched the sunrise and made herself a promise. However long this took, however difficult it became, she would see it through to the end. She would watch Derek Vance face justice. She would reclaim the piece of herself she'd lost 5 years ago when she'd been forced to choose between speaking truth and staying employed. This time, truth would win. It had to. The call came 6 weeks later. Sarah was working the lunch shift at a diner in Queens, a fallback job she'd found 3 days after her unemployment benefits ran out. The pay was worse than Thornton's, the customers were ruder, and the tips barely covered subway fare. But it kept her moving forward, kept the bills from piling up quite as fast, kept her from drowning in the waiting. 6 weeks of silence from Jennifer Torres. 6 weeks of watching Derek Vance continue to work at Thornton's, continue to walk free, continue to exist in the world as if he hadn't stolen millions, hadn't destroyed lives, hadn't threatened everyone who dared to challenge him. 6 weeks of Sarah lying awake at night, wondering if she'd made a mistake, if the evidence would hold up, if justice was just another story people told themselves to feel better about a fundamentally unfair world. Then her phone buzzed. Jennifer Torres. Ms. Mitchell, we're ready. Saturday evening, Thornton's will be hosting their annual board dinner. Richard Thornton will be present along with the entire executive team and major investors. Derek Vance will be there. So will we. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. You're arresting him. We're confronting him with evidence in a setting where he can't run, can't destroy records, and can't claim ignorance. We have subpoenaed bank records that confirm the shell companies. We have handwriting analysis that proves the forged signatures. We have testimony from 3 former employees about Derek's threats and intimidation. And we have your original documentation tying it all together. What do you need from me? I need you to be there, not as an investigator, as a witness, as the person who started this, who refused to stay silent. Richard Thornton doesn't know about our investigation yet. We've kept it completely confidential. When we present our findings, I want you in that room. I want Derek to see you. I want him to know that the woman he tried to erase is the reason his entire world is collapsing. Sarah felt something fierce and hot rise in her chest. Not quite vengeance, not quite triumph, something more primal than either. Recognition. After 5 years of being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as if her truth didn't matter, she was about to become undeniable. I'll be there. Good. 7 p.m. Come to the service entrance. I'll have someone waiting for you. The call ended. Sarah stood in the diner's kitchen, her hands shaking slightly, her breath coming faster than it should. Around her, the lunch rush continued. Orders being called out, plates clattering. The perpetual chaos of feeding people who would forget her face the moment they left. She untied her apron and found her manager, a weary woman named Rosa, who had hired Sarah without asking too many questions about the gap in her resume. I need Saturday evening off. Rosa looked up from the register. Sarah, Saturday's our busiest night. I need you here. I know, but I have something I have to do. Something important. Something in Sarah's voice must have conveyed the weight of the moment because Rosa studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, but if you're not back by Monday, don't bother coming back at all. I'll be here Monday. Sarah went home and told her mother. Grace was having a good day, strong enough to sit up without the oxygen color in her cheeks that had been absent for weeks. The new medication was working, the doctor had said. Not a cure, but a reprieve. Time measured in months instead of weeks. It's happening Saturday, Sarah said. The Attorney General is confronting Derek at the board dinner. Grace smiled. It was the smile Sarah remembered from childhood before the illness, before the exhaustion of survival had worn her mother down to someone who existed rather than lived. Then you wear the suit, the good one, the one that makes you look like the financial analyst you still are. Mama, I'm a diner waitress now. No, baby. You're a fraud investigator who happens to work in a diner. There's a difference. Saturday arrived with the kind of autumn clarity that made New York beautiful, the air crisp and clean, the sky impossibly blue. Sarah spent the morning with Jordan, helping him with college applications, talking about futures that suddenly seemed possible again. Financial aid packages, scholarship essays, the kind of boring, ordinary planning that had felt like fantasy when every dollar was spoken for before it was earned. "You think you'll go back to finance?" Jordan asked as they reviewed his application to NYU's business school. "After all this is over?" Sarah thought about the version of herself who had loved spreadsheets and patterns, who had found beauty in the logic of numbers, who had believed that fraud detection was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Maybe, but different than before. Not just analyzing numbers for banks. Something that matters more directly. Something where I can see the impact. Like what? I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. At 6 p.m., Sarah put on the suit. Navy blue, professionally tailored back when she could afford such things, now slightly loose because she'd lost weight over the past months. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not the waitress, not the struggling daughter. Someone harder. Someone who had survived and learned and refused to break. Grace appeared in the doorway. "You look like yourself again. I feel like someone different." "You are different. You're who you would have become if Derek Vance hadn't tried to stop you. You're who you are despite him. That's better." Sarah took the subway to Manhattan. The train was crowded with Saturday evening travelers, people dressed for dinners and shows and dates, people whose lives didn't include confrontations with criminals, whose problems were ordinary and manageable. Sarah envied them and pitied them in equal measure. Thornton's looked exactly as she remembered. The glass facade reflecting the evening lights, the brass fixtures gleaming, the doorman in his formal uniform greeting guests with practiced courtesy. Sarah walked past the main entrance to the service alley where the restaurant's elegant mass gave way to dumpsters and loading docks. Jennifer Torres was waiting, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, wearing a suit that marked her as someone important. Two other people stood with her, both carrying briefcases. NYAG investigators, Sarah guessed. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you for coming." "Thank you for doing this." Jennifer studied Sarah's face. "You should know what happens. Tonight will be difficult to watch. We'll be presenting evidence in front of Derek's colleagues, his boss, people who have trusted him for years. Some of them won't want to believe it. Some will get angry. It won't be clean or simple." "I don't need clean or simple. I need justice." "Good. Follow me." They entered through the service door. The kitchen was in full preparation for the evening, cooks moving with choreographed precision, the air thick with heat and complicated smells. Sarah recognized some of the staff. They recognized her too, their expressions registering surprise and confusion at seeing her here in a suit, walking with investigators like she belonged. Marcus Webb appeared from the dining room. His eyes widened when he saw Sarah. "What's happening?" he asked quietly. "Tonight," Sarah said simply. "It's happening tonight." Marcus nodded. Understanding and relief and terror crossed his face in rapid succession. "Thank God. I didn't know how much longer I could watch him walk around like he owned everything." "He did own everything," Jennifer said. "For a while, but that ends tonight. Mr. Webb, we'll need you to join us. Your testimony is part of our presentation." They moved through the restaurant to a private dining room on the second floor. The kind of room reserved for important occasions, intimate gatherings of powerful people making decisions that would ripple outward through industries and markets. Sarah had never been in this room during her time at Thornton's. Staff didn't belong here. This was the domain of money and influence. Tonight she belonged. The room was already occupied. A long mahogany table set for 20 people. Crystal glasses catching candlelight. Place cards indicating careful seating arrangements. And at the head of the table, Richard Thornton. Sarah had never seen him in person before. Had only known him as a name, a story her mother told, a ghost from a past that shaped her existence without her consent. He was 70, silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Handsome in the way wealthy men often were, their features refined by good nutrition and low stress and the ability to pay for perfection. He looked up as Jennifer entered, followed by her team and Sarah and Marcus. "Who are you?" His voice was calm, curious rather than defensive. "I don't believe you were on the guest list for this evening." "Mr. Thornton, my name is Jennifer Torres. I'm a senior investigator with the New York State Attorney General's office. I apologize for the interruption, but we have information that requires your immediate attention regarding financial irregularities at Thornton's restaurant." The room went silent. The other board members, executives in suits and dresses that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, turned to stare. Some looked annoyed, some looked concerned. One man older than the others looked almost pleased, as if scandal was something he'd been expecting. Derek Vance stood near the bar, a drink in his hand, his expression already shifting from relaxed to wary. His eyes found Sarah. She watched recognition hit him like a physical blow. His face went pale, then flushed red. "What is she doing here?" Derek's voice was tight. "That woman was fired for theft. She's not—" "Mr. Vance," Jennifer interrupted smoothly, "I'd appreciate if you'd let me finish before speaking. Mr. Thornton, may we use the projection screen?" Richard gestured to the wall where a screen descended smoothly from the ceiling. One of Jennifer's team members connected a laptop. The first slide appeared. Elite Provisions, LLC, a comprehensive analysis of systematic fraud. Jennifer began speaking. Her voice was professional, clinical, devoid of emotion. She walked the room through the evidence with the precision of someone who had prosecuted dozens of similar cases. Fake vendor invoices, non-existent business addresses, forged signatures on authorization documents. Sarah watched Derek's face as each piece of evidence appeared on screen. Watched him try to maintain composure, to look confused rather than guilty, to perform innocence for his colleagues. But the evidence was overwhelming. Invoice after invoice. 47 fraudulent payments totaling $2.3 million. Cross-referenced with receiving logs that showed zero actual deliveries. Bank records proving Elite Provisions funneled money to Deepwood V Holdings, a shell company owned by Derek Vance. "These are the facts," Jennifer said. "Amito, verified through subpoenaed bank records, forensic accounting, and an analysis and testimony from multiple witnesses. Mr. Vance has been systematically stealing from Thornton's restaurant for 3 years." Richard Thornton's face had gone rigid. He looked at Derek with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Betrayal, certainly, but also something else. Disappointment, as if Derek had confirmed something Richard had suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. "Derek, is this true?" Derek set down his drink with a hand that shook slightly. "Mr. Thornton, this is clearly some kind of mistake. I don't know who this woman is or what she told these investigators, but—" "I'm Sarah Mitchell," Sarah said. Her voice was steady, clear, carrying across the room with authority she hadn't known she possessed. "I worked as a server at this restaurant for 6 months. 5 years ago, I was a financial analyst at J.P. Morgan Chase. I discovered Mr. Vance's embezzlement scheme at a hotel chain he was managing. He responded by framing me for the same crime, having me fired and blacklisted from the industry." She paused. Every eye in the room was on her now. "When I recognized him here, I stayed quiet. I was afraid. I needed this job. I needed the money. But then he fired me for accepting a legitimate tip from a guest. He publicly accused me of theft again. And I realized that staying silent, staying afraid, was exactly what men like Derek Vance count on. So I investigated. I found the same pattern of fraud he used 5 years ago, and I brought it to the Attorney General's office because I believe that truth matters more than fear." Derek's mask cracked. "You had no right to access those records. You broke into the accounting office. You stole confidential documents." "I accessed records that were later subpoenaed legally," Jennifer interrupted, "which makes Ms. Mitchell's initial discovery irrelevant to our case. What matters is what we found when we conducted our own investigation. And what we found, Mr. Vance, is that you forged Richard Thornton's signature on 47 authorization documents. You created a fake vendor. You stole $2.3 million over 3 years. Those are facts supported by forensic evidence that will hold up in any court in this state." "I'd like to see more specific proof of the forged signatures," Richard said quietly. His voice was controlled, but Sarah could hear the anger beneath it, carefully leashed. Jennifer nodded and pulled up a new slide. Side-by-side comparison. Richard's genuine signature on company documents next to the signatures on Elite Provisions invoices. The differences were subtle but clear once pointed out. The flourish on the R, the angle of the final N, small variations that became obvious under scrutiny. "We also have security footage," Jennifer said, "from 2 months ago. Mr. Frank Chen, a busboy at this restaurant, forgot his phone and returned after hours. He witnessed Mr. Vance in his office at 2 a.m. copying signatures from legitimate documents onto blank invoices. Mr. Chen was too frightened to report it at the time, but he came forward during our investigation." Frank stepped into the room. He looked terrified, shoulders hunched, avoiding Derek's eyes. But he was here. He had found his courage. "It's true," Frank said quietly. "I saw him. He was alone in his office, forging Mr. Thornton's signature. When he found out I'd been in the building, he threatened my family. Said he'd report my parents' restaurant to immigration even though we're all legal. I was too scared to say anything. I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. You spoke up when it mattered, Jennifer said. That's what counts. Derek was backing toward the door now, his composure completely shattered. This isn't mine. You are all insane. I've worked for this company for 3 years. I've increased efficiency, improved profit margins, streamlined operations. By stealing from us, Richard said. His voice was cold now, all pretense of civility gone. By forging my signature, by lying to my face every day for 3 years. I never. Derek's voice rose desperate now. She's lying. She's been lying from the beginning. 5 years ago, she was caught stealing, and she's been planning revenge ever since. This entire investigation is based on the word of a criminal. No, Marcus Webb said. He stepped forward, his voice shaking but firm. This investigation is based on facts, numbers, documents. I've worked at Thornton's for 22 years. I've seen the invoices. I've noticed the deliveries that never came. I stayed silent because I was afraid of you, Derek. Afraid of losing my job, my pension, everything I've built. But I'm not afraid anymore. Marcus, don't do this, Derek said. The plea in his voice was ugly naked in its desperation. You have a family. You have kids in college. If you testify against me, if you help them destroy me, I'll make sure you lose everything. Stop talking, Richard said. The command was absolute. Derek, you're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. If you attempt to access any company systems, if you attempt to contact any employees, if you do anything except wait for the criminal charges that are coming, I will personally ensure that you spend every remaining dollar you have on legal fees. 2 security guards entered the room. They moved to flank Derek, professional and implacable. Derek looked around wildly, searching for support, for sympathy, for any crack in the wall of evidence and testimony closing around him. His eyes landed on Sarah. For a moment, they stared at each other across the dining room. She saw everything in his face: rage, fear, and beneath it all, recognition. He had underestimated her, had thought she would stay broken, had believed his power was enough to keep her silent. He had been wrong. You'll regret this, Derek said to Sarah. His voice was low, venomous. I'll fight these charges. I'll win. And when I do, when you do nothing, Jennifer said, because you're not going to win, Mr. Vance. We have ironclad evidence. We have testimony from multiple witnesses. We have forensic accounting that proves every dollar you stole. You're going to prison. The only question is for how long. The security guards took Derek's arms. He tried to pull away, then seemed to realize the futility of resistance. They escorted him from the room. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. The silence that followed was profound. Richard Thornton sat down heavily in his chair. He looked older, suddenly worn in a way that wealth couldn't polish away. How long has this been going on? 3 years, Jennifer said. Possibly longer if he ran similar schemes at other properties in your portfolio. We're expanding our investigation to check. Richard nodded slowly. Then he looked at Sarah, really looked at her for the first time. His eyes were sharp, assessing the gaze of someone who had built an empire by reading people accurately. Sarah Mitchell, he said, Marcus mentioned you earlier. You were an employee here. Yes, sir, for 6 months. And Derek fired you. Yes, sir. Falsely accused me of theft just as he did 5 years ago at J.P. Morgan Chase. Richard's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes, some calculation or recognition. You investigated this fraud on your own, while working minimum wage jobs, while supporting a family. You could have walked away, found another mom, stayed quiet. Why didn't you? Sarah thought about the question. About all the reasons that were true but incomplete. About fear and anger and justice, and her mother's voice telling her that courage meant acting despite terror, not in absence of it. Because someone had to, she said finally, and it turned out that someone was me. Richard studied her face for another long moment. Then he turned to Jennifer. What happens now? We'll file formal charges within the week. Wire fraud, forgery, embezzlement, multiple counts of each. Mr. Vance will be arrested. Given the amount involved and the systematic nature of the fraud, I expect he'll be denied bail. Trial will likely be 6 to 8 months out. And the money, well, we've frozen the accounts we've identified. Most of the $2.3 million is still recoverable. The rest was spent on personal expenses that can be traced and will be part of the restitution order. Richard nodded. He looked exhausted. Thank you, Ms. Torres. Please keep me informed of any developments. I'll instruct our legal team to cooperate fully with your investigation." Jennifer and her team began packing up their materials. The board members filtered out in small clusters, their voices hushed, already spinning the narrative they would tell shareholders and the press. A trusted executive gone rogue. Swift action taken. No systemic failures, just one bad actor now removed from the organization. Sarah watched them leave and felt hollow. They would weather this scandal. The restaurant would recover. Richard Thornton would implement new oversight systems and continue running his empire. In 6 months, this would be a footnote in the company's history. But for Sarah, for Marcus, for Frank, for everyone Derek had threatened and intimidated and dismissed, this was everything. This was the moment that proved their voices mattered, that speaking truth to power was not futile, that sometimes the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. Marcus approached Sarah as she prepared to leave. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up, for making me brave enough to stop being a coward." "You were never a coward, Marcus. You were just surviving. There's a difference." "Maybe, but I should have spoken up sooner. I should have protected people like you instead of protecting myself." "You spoke up when it counted. That's what matters." Frank Chen appeared next, still looking shaken but standing straighter than Sarah had ever seen him. "My dad called. He heard about what happened. He said I did the right thing. He said he was proud of me." Sarah smiled. "He should be. You risked everything to tell the truth." "We all did," Frank said. "But you started it. You were the one who wouldn't stay silent." They left together, the three of them walking through the restaurant that had been the site of their fear and their courage in equal measure. The dining room was filling with the regular Saturday crowd, now wealthy people, unaware that anything unusual had happened, that justice had been served while they decided between the salmon and the steak. Outside, the city continued its perpetual motion. Sarah said goodbye to Marcus and Frank and walked toward the subway, her mind already turning to the future. The trial, the testimony, the long process of legal proceedings that would determine how many years Derek spent in prison. Her phone rang. "Grace. Baby, how did it go?" "It's over, Mama. Derek was fired. He's going to be arrested. The evidence held up. Everything worked." Grace's voice broke slightly. "I knew it would. I knew you could do this. I couldn't have done it without you. You're the one who sent the files to the Attorney General. You're the one who taught me to fight back. No, baby. I taught you to survive. You taught yourself to fight. There's a difference." Sarah rode the subway home in a daze. Exhaustion and relief and something approaching peace settled over her. She had done it. After 5 years of being broken, of believing she was powerless, of accepting that people like Derek Vance always won, she had proven that truth could still matter. The apartment was warm when she arrived. Jordan had made dinner, actual dinner, from actual ingredients rather than ramen or cereal. He grinned when Sarah walked in. "Marcus called. He told me everything. He said you were amazing." Said Derek looked like he was going to pass out when they showed all the evidence. "It wasn't just me. It was Marcus and Frank and Mom and the investigators. It was everyone who refused to stay silent." Grace called from her bedroom. Sarah went to her, sat on the edge of the bed, took her mother's hand. "You did good, baby." "We did good, together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Grace spoke again, her voice soft. "You know Richard Thornton is your father, right? You know that investigating his company, exposing fraud in his organization, that brings you into his world, whether you wanted it or not." "I know. Are you going to tell him?" Sarah thought about it. About the man she'd seen tonight, powerful and betrayed, and trying to maintain control in a situation that had spiraled beyond his management. About the relationship, they didn't have the absence that had defined her entire life. "No," she said finally. "Not now, maybe not ever. He has enough to deal with, and I don't need him to acknowledge me to know I have value." Grace smiled. "That's my girl." The weeks that followed took on a strange rhythm. Derek Vance was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Perp walked out of his apartment building while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. The story made local news. Financial executive charged with massive fraud. It was a minor scandal in a city that generated scandals like other places it generated weather. Sarah watched the coverage with detached satisfaction. Derek looked small on screen. Diminished. Not the powerful executive who had destroyed her career, just a man in handcuffs facing consequences. The trial date was set for 6 months out. Jennifer Torres called regularly with updates. Derek had hired expensive lawyers who were already trying to negotiate a plea deal. The evidence was too strong to fight directly, so they were arguing for reduced charges, lighter sentencing any angle that might keep their client from spending a decade in prison. They'll probably succeed in reducing some of the charges, Jennifer told Sarah during one of their calls. Not because Derek deserves leniency, but because the system rewards people who cooperate and plead guilty instead of taking up court time. He'll still serve years, just maybe 5 instead of 10. Will that be enough? Enough for what, justice deterrence? There's no number of years that can undo what he did to you, to Marcus, to Frank, to everyone he intimidated. But it's something. It's accountability. That matters. Sarah returned to work at the diner. Rosa had kept her word, held her position, even gave her a small raise when Sarah explained what had happened at Thornton's. The work was still exhausting, the customers still difficult, the pay still barely adequate. But Sarah found she didn't mind as much. She was working because she chose to, not because fear had eliminated all other options. Marcus called 3 weeks after Derek's arrest. Richard Thornton wants to meet with you. Sarah's stomach tightened. Why? He didn't say, but he asked me to arrange it, said it was important. Personal, not business. Sarah thought about refusing. She had spent 26 years not knowing Richard Thornton, not needing him, building a life that didn't include the man who had abandoned her mother. What could he possibly say now that would matter? But curiosity won. Or perhaps it was something deeper. The need to see him not as an abstract concept, not as the villain in her mother's story, but as an actual human being, flawed and complicated and real. She agreed to meet him at a coffee shop. Not Thornton's, not his office, somewhere neutral, where they would just be two people having a conversation without the weight of corporate power dynamics. He was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table looking older than he had at the board dinner, worn in a way that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult reckonings. "Thank you for coming," he said as Sarah sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either." They sat in awkward silence for a moment. Richard ordered coffee for both of them, an automatic gesture of hospitality that Sarah recognized from her waitressing days. The instinct to make others comfortable even when you were uncomfortable yourself. "I've been thinking about what you said," Richard began, "at the board dinner, about investigating fraud at JP Morgan Chase 5 years ago, about Derek framing you and destroying your career, about you working minimum wage jobs to support your family while the man who ruined you kept climbing higher. That's all true. I know, I verified it. Called some contacts at JP Morgan, looked into Derek's employment history. You were right about everything. And I hired him. I brought him into my company. I gave him power he used to steal and intimidate and hurt people. You didn't know. I should have known. I should have done better due diligence. I should have checked his references more carefully. I should have noticed the red flags. But I didn't because he was charming and confident and told me what I wanted to hear." Richard looked directly at Sarah. "I'm sorry for what he did to you, for my part in enabling it by giving him authority he didn't deserve." Sarah didn't know what to say. An apology from Richard Thornton for Derek's actions felt strange and insufficient, beside the point somehow. "Why did you want to meet me?" she asked finally. Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured, as if he was testing each word before releasing it. "Because Marcus told me something about your mother, Grace Mitchell. He said she used to work as a hostess at one of my properties. 27 years ago, he said there was some kind of incident, that she left suddenly." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. "What else did Marcus tell you?" "Nothing, but I looked into it, found the old employment records. Grace Mitchell, hired as hostess, terminated after 6 months. No reason given in the file, which is unusual. We don't typically fire people without documentation unless there's something we don't want documented." He paused. "And I remembered her. Not well, not clearly, but I remembered. A beautiful woman who worked the evening shifts. We talked sometimes, more than we should have. And then she was gone, and I was told she'd quit, and I didn't ask questions because I was building an empire, and I didn't want complications." Sarah sat very still. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because when Marcus said her name, when I looked at your face at the board dinner, something clicked. The timing, the dates, the way you look at me like you know something I should know but don't. And I've been in business long enough to read between lines to see patterns in incomplete data." He leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, I need to ask you something directly. Am I your father?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah could lie, could deflect, could protect him from the truth and herself from the vulnerability of acknowledgement. But she had spent 6 weeks fighting for truth, had built a case on evidence and facts, and refusing to let power erase reality. She couldn't abandon that principle now just because the truth was personal instead of professional. Yes, she said simply. Grace Mitchell is my mother. You got her pregnant 27 years ago. When she told you, you offered money for an abortion. When she refused, you fired her and threatened her career and walked away. She raised me alone. You never looked back. Richard closed his eyes. His face seemed to collapse inward, nearing a decade in seconds. I was 43, building my third hotel, married to a woman who couldn't have children and was bitter about it, terrified of scandal, of losing everything I'd worked for. And Grace was young and black, and I told myself that our relationship was a mistake, that the pregnancy was a problem to be solved rather than a life to be valued. He opened his eyes. They were wet. I'm sorry, those words aren't enough. They're not even close to enough. But I don't know what else to say. I failed you. I failed your mother. I failed the man I thought I was. Why tell me this now? Why admit it when you could have just stayed silent? Let me walk away, never deal with any of this. Because you exposed Derek Vance. You could have walked away from that fight too. You could have stayed silent and safe. But you didn't. You chose truth over comfort. And if you can do that, if you can fight for what's right, even when it costs you everything, then the least I can do is acknowledge my own failures. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. What do you want from me? Nothing. You owe me nothing. You owe me less than nothing. But I want you to know that I see you now. I see what you've accomplished, what you've overcome, who you've become despite my absence. And I'm proud of you even though I have no right to be. You don't have that right, Sarah agreed. Her voice was steady, clear, without anger or forgiveness. Just fact. You gave up the right to be proud of me when you told my mother to get rid of me. I know. They sat in silence. The coffee shop moved around them. Other conversations, other lives, other people whose dramas were smaller and more manageable. What happens now? Richard asked finally. Nothing changes. You're not my father in any meaningful sense. You're just the biological donor who happened to contribute half my DNA. My mother raised me. She's the one who matters. I understand, but Sarah, if you ever need anything, if there's any way I can help, there is one thing. Name it. Hire Marcus Webb as your new CFO. He has integrity. He proved that by testifying, even though it could have cost him everything. And hire Frank Chen into a management training program. He's smart and brave and deserves a chance to build a career in this industry. Do that and we're square. Richard nodded slowly. Consider it done. Anything else? Sarah thought about it. About medical bills for her mother. About college tuition for Jordan. About all the ways Richard Thornton's money could solve the problems that kept her awake at night. But accepting that help would create a relationship she didn't want, would turn her into someone who needed him, would give him a role in her life he hadn't earned. No, she said, that's all I want from you. She stood to leave. Richard stood too. Sarah, can I ask you one more question? Go ahead. How is your mother? How is Grace? Sarah looked at him, saw genuine concern in his face, or perhaps just guilt dressed up as concern. It was hard to tell the difference. She's dying, heart failure. She has months, maybe a year if we're lucky. The medical bills are destroying us financially, but we're managing. Richard flinched. I could help with that. Medical expenses, treatments, whatever she needs. No, Sarah said firmly. She doesn't want your help. She's made that clear. She survived without you for 27 years. She'll finish her life the same way, on her own terms. Even if refusing my help means suffering, she doesn't have to endure. Even then, because dignity matters more than comfort. You should understand that. It's the same principle that made me investigate Derek, even though staying silent would have been easier. Sarah walked out of the coffee shop. She didn't look back. Behind her, Richard Thornton sat alone at the table confronting the consequences of choices made decades ago, learning that some debts couldn't be paid and some absences couldn't be filled no matter how much money you threw at the problem. 6 months later, Derek Vance pled guilty to wire fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The plea deal gave him 7 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before 5. It wasn't 10 years. It wasn't life. But it was enough. Sarah attended the sentencing hearing. So did Marcus and Frank. They sat together in the courtroom gallery watching Derek stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive suits and confident bearing stripped away to reveal the small, frightened man beneath. The judge was thorough in her condemnation. Mr. Vance, you betrayed the trust of your employer, threatened and intimidated those who might expose you, and showed no remorse for your actions until confronted with irrefutable evidence. You represent the worst kind of white-collar criminal, educated privileged, with every advantage, yet choosing to steal from those who gave you opportunity. 7 years is lenient. Use them wisely. Derek was led away. He didn't look at Sarah. Perhaps he couldn't bear to. Perhaps acknowledging her meant acknowledging his own defeat. Outside the courthouse, Jennifer Torres shook Sarah's hand. Thank you for seeing this through. These cases don't succeed without witnesses willing to stand up and testify. Thank you for believing me, for taking the evidence seriously even though I was just a waitress with a history of being accused of fraud. You were never just a waitress. You were an investigator who happened to work in a restaurant. There's a difference. Sarah returned to work at the diner. But not for long. 3 weeks after Derek's sentencing, Marcus Webb called with an offer. Richard wants to hire you as Director of Internal Compliance for Thornton Hospitality Group. You'd be responsible for auditing all properties, investigating any irregularities, implementing systems to prevent fraud. Salaried is $120,000 plus benefits. Full authority to report directly to the board if you find anything suspicious. Sarah thought about it for exactly 10 seconds. No. No, Sarah, this is a dream job for someone with your skills. Why would you refuse? Because I don't want to work for my father. I don't want to owe him anything. And I don't want to spend my life auditing restaurants when I could be doing something that matters more directly. Then what do you want to do? Sarah smiled. She had been thinking about this question for months, turning it over in her mind during slow shifts at the diner, during subway rides, during the quiet hours before sleep. I want to start a nonprofit, an organization that helps workers in the hospitality industry document wage theft, fraud, abuse. That provides free legal support and investigation services to people who can't afford lawyers. That teaches people how to gather evidence, how to protect themselves, how to fight back when powerful people try to silence them. That's ambitious. It's necessary. For every Derek Vance we catch, there are 100 others who get away with it because their victims are too scared or too poor to fight back. I want to change that. Marcus was quiet for a moment. How will you fund it? I'm working on that. There are grants, foundations, people who care about labor rights. It'll take time, but I'll figure it out. What if Richard wanted to be your first major donor? Anonymous, no strings attached. No credit, just funding because it's the right thing to do. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Why would he do that? Because he knows he can't fix the past, but maybe he can help build a better future. Not for you not to earn your forgiveness, but because the work matters. Sarah thought about her mother's voice, about dignity and principles and refusing to let power dictate your choices. But she also thought about all the people she could help with proper funding, all the workers who would suffer while she spent years cobbling together grants from foundations that might not exist. Okay, she said finally, but it stays anonymous. No press releases, no using my story to make him look good, just funding for the mission. Can he agree to that? I'll make sure he does. The nonprofit launched 6 months later. Workers' Defense Initiative, they called it. Sarah ran it from a small office in Queens, assisted by a team of volunteers that included Frank Chen, who had deferred college for a year to help build something he believed in. They took on cases across the city. Restaurant workers cheated out of tips. Hotel staff threatened with deportation. Wage theft hidden in complicated payroll systems. Each case was small in isolation but enormous to the people living through it. Each victory was proof that speaking up mattered, that systems could work, that justice wasn't just for those who could afford expensive lawyers. Grace lived long enough to see the nonprofit's first anniversary. They celebrated in her hospital room because she was too weak to leave, too sick to do much, besides smile and hold Sarah's hand. But she was there. She witnessed what her daughter had built from pain and courage and refusal to accept that the world's cruelty was inevitable. I'm proud of you, baby, Grace whispered. Her voice was thin, each word an effort. You turned what Derek tried to destroy into something beautiful. I learned that from you, Mama. You turned what Richard tried to erase into me. Grace died 2 weeks later peacefully, with Sarah and Jordan beside her. The funeral was small. Friends from the neighborhood, a few co-workers from the restaurants where Grace had worked over the years. Marcus and Frank representing the community Sarah had built through her fight. Richard Thornton sent flowers but didn't attend. Sarah was grateful for that. Some absences were more appropriate than presence. In the years that followed, Sarah built the Workers' Defense Initiative into a regional organization with offices in 3 cities. They helped hundreds of workers recover stolen wages, expose fraud, hold employers accountable. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it mattered in ways that analyzing spreadsheets for banks never had. Derek Vance served his full 7 years. Sarah didn't think about him much. He had taken 5 years of her life, had tried to take everything, but in the end he had given her something too. Purpose, clarity, the understanding that speaking truth to power wasn't just right, it was essential. 10 years after that Saturday night at Thornton's restaurant, Sarah stood in a conference room in City Hall, accepting an award for public service. The mayor was there, city council members, representatives from labor unions and advocacy groups. Jordan, now a lawyer specializing in employment discrimination, sat in the front row, beaming with pride. In her acceptance speech, Sarah told the story, not all of it, not the personal details, but the core narrative. A waitress accused of theft, an investigation that uncovered systemic fraud, a fight for justice that proved speaking up could matter. "I'm not a hero," Sarah said. "I'm just someone who refused to stay silent when silence would have been easier." And the real lesson isn't about me, it's about systems. When we build systems that protect powerful people and punish those who challenge them, we create environments where fraud flourishes. When we build systems that take accusations seriously, that investigate rather than dismiss, that protect whistleblowers rather than punish them, we create accountability. She looked out at the audience. Every person in this room has power. You can choose to use it to maintain systems that protect the status quo, or you can use it to build systems that protect people. Choose wisely. The workers you save might include your own children. The applause was warm, genuine. Sarah accepted it with the same calm she'd brought to everything since that night she'd walked out of Thornton's with torn pieces of a check on her uniform. She had learned something essential that night, that she couldn't control what powerful people did, but she could control how she responded, could choose truth over comfort, courage over fear, justice over expedience. And that choice, repeated day after day, year after year, was enough to change the world. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. After the ceremony, Sarah walked through the city, past Thornton's restaurant, still operating, still elegant now, with proper oversight systems and a compliance department that actually investigated irregularities. Past the diner where she'd worked, now closed, replaced by a luxury condo. Past the subway station where she'd ridden home after being fired, broken, scared, and certain her life was over. She wasn't that person anymore, had grown beyond that moment into someone harder and softer simultaneously, someone who understood both the cruelty of systems and the possibility of changing them, someone who had taken pain and transformed it into purpose. Sarah's phone buzzed, Jordan texting about dinner plans. She smiled and typed a response. Headed home to an apartment she actually owned now, in a better neighborhood with room for the life she'd built through years of work that mattered. The city moved around her. Millions of stories, millions of struggles, millions of small battles between power and principle, playing out in offices and restaurants and courtrooms across every borough. Sarah was just one person, but she had learned that one person speaking truth was sometimes enough to start an avalanche, sometimes enough to change everything. She had been that person once. Now she spent her days helping others find that courage in themselves. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.